TK here, TK and Drinks, and we've got another Inside the Mead Maker studio coming at you, where we explore the world of mead making, talk to mead makers from around the world, and catch a buzz on some of the best meads around. Today, we are going to be speaking with Nico from Stardust Cellars in North Carolina. He's going to crush me for that. We've been having a little bit of difficulty joining up, so looks like we've got a request sent in here. We can link up this time. We've been having, again, some technical difficulties, and
Hey, is it working?
I think I've adjusted the foil on my antennas just so.
Oh my
And I
God, it's
think
working.
yes, it is. It's absolutely working.
What?
Hey, man, like I
All
said,
right.
it's the ebb and flow of
That's
the universe. I'm here
just how
for it,
it
though.
works, man. That's just how it goes.
Yes, everybody, we can see each other. You guys can see us. All things are
Yep,
good in the world. So
yep, yep.
thank you,
Well, it's good to
everybody, for
be here.
coming back and dealing with all my technical difficulties. That was unfortunate. But again, like you said, we've made it here. So, everybody, this is Nico from Stardust Cellars,
Yeah.
and I can't remember what town in North Carolina.
North Wilkesboro, actually, North Carolina.
There you go, Wilksboro, North Carolina. Um, One of the reasons why I wanted to talk to you and speak mead with you and whatnot is you guys do a lot of spontaneous fermentation, and that always intrigues me. Is it something I'm kind of, I say, terrified to do, but it's certainly on the uncomfortable side of the scale for me. And I figure the more people I talk to about that, maybe the more comfortable I'll get with it. And I think it's a great thing for other people to hear and experience as well. So thank you for joining me, brother.
Of course, glad to be here.
Um, but you go ahead and give us a little background about yourself and meadery, little history, one over, and all that jazz before
Yep,
we dive into it too much.
sounds good. Good. Yeah. Nico the mead scientist, people call me. I am the inventor of ancestral mead. So it all kind of started out with this thing over here, but literally two ingredients, just raw honey and water. And everything we do, we actually use biodynamic principles to make our products. So everything we do comes from our mountain itself. The honey we get from Wilkes County. The water is literally from our mountain. We're actually off grid. So it's well water that we're pulling up from the ground. And the cool thing is,
Nice.
we're not using any tap water. Nothing's going to kill our yeast or natural microbes. So the whole idea behind it is just spontaneously ferment, just mix raw honey, local water. So very terroir driven for our meads until it spontaneously ferments. And there's a lot of tricks behind it. But originally we were a winery. So we, planted grapes. We have a biodynamic vineyard. So it's all like the sheep's graze. It's all natural, no sprays, no pesticides, just what the earth
Sweet.
provides. And actually, we're on track to be the first biodynamic certified winery in the South, which is kind of crazy. But so those practices are kind of where I came from
Okay.
when I started Stardust in 2018. So we applied those same principles to mead because Wilkes is one of the best places to find honey. Like there's beekeepers in 2 minutes in every direction from us. Just beekeeping and mead making has an ancient history in the Appalachian Mountains where we are. If you're not
Okay.
familiar with Sandor Cats and a lot of the folks in Asheville who've been doing natural wild crafting of mead, that's centered around our mountain range. So there's actually a large history of natural mead making where we are. So really, I'm not reinventing the wheel, but I did create a new process. Effectively applying method ancestral from Le Mans in France, where they're fermenting something down using the overwintering, the cold temperatures to stop fermentation early, and then bottling when there's still a little residual honey in the bottle. And so these bottles actually will be naturally a little effervescent because the bottle conditioning happens from the native microbes from that raw honey, and they're fermenting it down, and they're eating up a little bit of residual honey and bubbling it up. And it's a little different than a pet net. A pet net's a little bit more rudimentary. Ancestral method is actually you're racking it multiple times. You're letting the cold temperatures settle everything, and it's waking back up in the when it reaches back to warm temperatures in the spring inside the bottle. So it's kind of like a more advanced pet net, effectively, but applying that to mead. So we're the first people to do that
Whoa.
here in the States. And it works every time. So when people think spontaneous fermentation is really sketchy, we have a 100% success rate. In 6 years, we've actually never lost a batch of ancestral. It's always worked out, and that's because we're actually accounting for a lot of variables. So I
Sure.
designed a state-of-the-art facility with multiple different humidity and temperature control rooms. We also, the way we stir our products, biodynamically speaking, we're actually conjuring native microbes by stirring clockwise repeatedly for about 10 minutes a tank every single day.
Whoa.
And that ample stirring really gets that oxygen flow, creates these currents, and we're using egg-shaped fermenters, and that allows the natural, as the fermentation goes, it allows the heat to kind of create a convex current and allow perfect, movement of these microbes. So you end up with no hot spots, and I found that the native microbes, that they have that nice temperature balance, nobody's unhappy. It really allows you to have a healthy fermentation, but it takes a lot of stirring. Everyone on my team has been building their forearms, just going hard, but there's no other way. There's no other way to make it work. So we kind of got a little gym, effectively at our building. And and someone mentioned that. One of the cool things is we actually did, these spontaneous meads, it's really cool in concept, but we also got, we medaled at the Mazer Cup this year. So even in a blind tasting, the spontaneous fermentation does work, and it creates a product that even if you didn't know is spontaneous, you can really get interested by it. The notes from the Mazer Cup are just wild because everyone's like, what on earth is this craziness? But it's so complex and so interesting. There's even the probiotics that come on natural raw honey are just all over the place. They provide a really cool complexity. And my favorite thing is they provide this acid backbone that often's missing in mead. It doesn't have the best buffering system like wine does. So the gluconic acid that lactobacillus and other bacteria produce end up being our acidic component. And so it actually helps to make it a lot more palatable for the wine crowd who's looking for that acid component. And we've really struck a chord with the natural wine movement lately. So that's the gist.
Man, that is, I rarely meet people that can wax on prolific like I do, but you give a lot of good information in there and a very well thought out and practiced speech. So kudos to you for that.
I do it a lot.
Well, I mean, that's the signs of a good mead advocate. Yeah. That's somebody who's, again, passionate about the mead, passionate about the process and the things that they're doing, and wants to be able to have a concise, maybe a little bit longer than an elevator pitch, but, you want to have a concise speech ready to go for when, situations arrive, when people are interested in what you're doing and you want to share that knowledge. So again, I appreciate it. I think it's very cool.
Absolutely.
So let's dial this back a second here and go. We said we just won third and fourth. Now you won third and fourth for, was one of them for the ancestral itself?
So third place we got for the dry herbal meads, and it actually was our lavender mead. So our lavender mead, we actually pay homage to the origins of honey and lavender with this. So we talk about the steps of the Himalayan, like the plateaus, the Himalayan peoples, and actually the cover is Mad Honey Collector. If you're familiar with the psychedelic Mad Honey, it's a collector. So lavender actually is not from France. France got it from the Mediterranean. You got it from Asia. So we actually talk about the history of mead on every bottle we have. Nice. Ancestral mead, it's like a double entendre. We're actually talking about how the ancestors made mead, while also talking about the ancestral method here. But the lavender won third in the dry and herbal category. And then in the semi-sweet fruit and spice, this one got runner-up, fourth place, apple pie. Nice. And the cool thing about these funky ferments is we have a trademark on it. But funky ferments is actually spontaneously fermented, but then back sweetened. So these do have sulfites in them, but it's using our spontaneous fermentation and then making it a little bit more, contemporary in style. Something a little more semi-sweet.
Are those carbonated, or it's carbonated through like your same process that you're talking about, right?
Yeah, they're not carbonated. These are actually going to be still because they don't have the living fermentation still moving in the bottle because the sulfites and the and sorbate in it will stop the fermentation.
You mentioned that.
Otherwise, it would be explosive.
You're right.
But these here they have less than 1% of the honey when we bottle it. So the amount, if you do the calculations, the amount of carbon dioxide you're creating is going to be enough to make it bubbly, nice, like a nice big effervescence, but it's not going to blow up, So it's
Right.
not going to be, it's not as bubbly as champagne. It's a little bit dialed back because that's kind of preferred, more like a beer. But I found that the beer fermentation kind of effervescence really hits the spot.
But
But yeah,
you're able to ship them on like Vino Shipper and stuff without any
that's
problems. You're not
correct.
sending,
Yeah.
bottle bombs through the mail.
No problem. And the funny thing is, since we're in the
Cool.
South, we get to test the extremes. So we wait until the summer is, reaches that near, 95-degree, hot, humid.
Oof, that's brave.
And then my COO and I have both had some experience putting these bottles in our cars, driving around, leaving the car for a week or two, and seeing what explodes and what doesn't. So far, my
Yeah.
car's been winning. No explosions in my car, as far as
Uh-oh.
as far as I'm aware. But it's pretty fun. So we get to really nail it in, dial in the amount of sugar that's still in there.
Yeah.
And someone had a question about ABV being reached through wild fermentation. Our
Yeah.
meads actually are hitting 14%, but we can actually get them up to about 16 to 17% if you really stir and stir and stir. Yeast nutrition, when you get to those levels with wild fermentation, really depends on how much oxygen's in your culture, because you're building those healthy membranes. And with healthy membranes, you can really survive the higher alcohol percentages. So surprisingly, you can get a wild culture at 16, 17% if you really go for it. But
Now,
we like to standardize ours at 14.
now you said nutrition. Are you step feeding your, maybe I missed that in your, when you were talking, what is your nutrition,
Yeah.
schedule
So
for those?
it depends, right? So we have products with cherry. So this is our cherry blood. This
Hmm.
with cherry, you don't actually have to add any nutrients. Same with the blackberry. Anything with fruit, for the most part, we haven't had any need for nutrition. The main
Wow.
nutritive force that I like to call as a nutrition aid is actually oxygen itself. So
Wow.
oxygen is used to build healthy cell membranes. So this is a microbiological concept, and we kind of applied it to actual practice where we stir and stir and stir. And when we do, we actually splash heavily, and you'll see, giant explosions, like big ass, splashes happening with our team. They're just going at it hard.
Yeah.
And that big incorporation of oxygen is what builds these healthy membranes. Now, for something like that has no added fruit or anything, we'll add just a little bit of superfood, a few days in to kind of give it a little bit of boost, because if it runs out of nitrogen, and you could test your honey, and some honeys actually have enough nitrogen, but for the most part, we haven't found that all honeys have enough to do the full fermentation. So depending
Okay.
on what our starting material is, we will add a little bit of superfood. And that alone, no DAP, nothing else, no B vitamins, just a little bit of superfood, and that's done wonders for us.
Wow.
And that's given us, no issues whatsoever, as long as you stir really, really heavily.
That, and that's really weird because a lot of the concepts and everything that I've been taught and talked to people about, introducing oxygen beyond, 72 hours is pretty much, a sin. And here
Right?
you guys are, purposefully introducing oxygen. And then you said you guys used egg-shaped fermenters as opposed to conical ones. So a conical, I'm assuming, it's just an egg shape, or, with a few slight shapes. It's just an inverted, where your bulbous part is on the bottom and your more conical part is on the top.
Yeah, that's right. There's no sharp points, and there's definitely no edges. That's a big problem. You don't want any edges or any like degrees. You want everything to be curved, because if it's curved, you're going to have your yeast and everything kind of rolling off of it. And actually, the egg shape specifically, if you know the green eggs they use in
Hmm.
cooking, the grills, they also create this convex current, and the shape itself mixed with heat actually creates this spinning motion. So you end up with no temperature hotspots, and that's how you create the perfect burger, just like you'd create the perfect recipe of fermentation. No
Gotcha.
hotspots means you're not going to get angry yeast. They're going to change their biochemistry and start metabolizing things they wouldn't normally, just because they need to offset that exothermic reaction or endothermic reaction or whatever the issue is, where they suddenly have to get colder or hotter. You're kind of just dialing into that one nice perfect fermentation temperature. Hotspots are how you create fusel alcohols. So our fermentations are completely free of any fusel alcohols because of that.
Very, very cool. And you said you're a microbiologist by trade?
Yeah, so I'm a published microbiologist in the wine and mead field. So I
Awesome.
actually discovered new microorganisms in wine. So I got to name a few of them, but some of the species I discovered were in the Bacillus family, and I was able to prove that soil microbes are actually able to survive and grow and get into wine. And it was a big problem up in the Pacific Northwest. They
Wow.
had wines, natural wines, that started tasting like dirt a little bit. And so I was like, dirt smells like dirt because of the microbes in the dirt. So I had this theory that soil microbes actually could get into the wine just based on smell testing. And I
Whoa.
ran everything through an ultrafiltration setup, and I was able to get some measurable colonies. And I was able to plate a few and characterize them. I found out that they had, over time evolved to develop alcohol tolerance, as well as a pH
Whoa.
tolerance, all the way down to 3.2 even, which was wild
Whoa.
because every textbook you read says that soil bacteria can't make their way through the vines into the pips, into wine. And I was
Yeah.
able to prove that actually there is evolutionary factors at play in the Pacific Northwest that are force evolving these species to start to be able to actually grow in wine. And branch that out. There's got to be species ready to discover all across the world in winemaking and mead making. And I keep trying to get students, to publish some research around wild mead. I might have to just do it myself at this point, but I think there's just
Dude,
an infinite amount of publishable results in the food microbiology or wine microbiology world, especially when you apply it to mead.
that's awesome. It's like you're getting to see evolution like in progress, like as it's
In
happening.
real
Like
time.
I think that's
Yeah.
a yeah, in real time. I think that's kind of a being understated as an awesome thing. Like that, I think that's really cool. And like you said, the fact that there's not a bunch of young kids out there diving into something that's so, you know, relevant to, evolution and whatnot. That's wild,
Yeah.
wild stuff.
It's
I might have to have you
seriously.
back on and talk about yeast microbes and stuff later on,
Please do. I'm
specifically.
down.
Oh, excellent. Um, so you use this process. You got the egg-shaped fermenters. You use all the natural yeast and microbes and everything that comes from the honey and the fruit, specifically to create this no hot spots, no fusel alcohols, this ancestral process. Um, what was the desire, or like what was the driving desire to go that route with it? What had you experienced like poor meads in the past, or was it just something that you wanted to get into it? Like what drove the sciencey part of the mead making?
Well, two things. A lot of the mead that's on the market or has been on the market is often semi-sweet, or sweet. When I was looking at labels, I saw sulfites, benzoate on everything, and that's a great tool to make sweet meads, but not a lot of dry meads. And the biggest thing that I noticed was just every single thing had a pitched yeast. Everybody online is talking about, their D47, their EC118, their
Mm.
yeast they
Oh
use
yeah,
of choice. And my background is in microbiology, and most specifically forced evolution microbiology. Adaptation, evolution, how that interplays in the wine world. And so I wanted to see, almost like, just is it possible to create a truly reproducible process to create something spontaneous? And talking to folks in the natural wine world, they say, oh, it's so risky to do wine spontaneously because every
mm.
year you might have to throw the whole thing away if it gets stinky, if it goes bad. And so mead seemed like this new frontier for me to see, well, can I apply what I've learned about natural wine into the mead world? And I wasn't really coming up with many examples of people doing it. And
Sure.
I'm just the kind of person who, if it doesn't exist, I build it. I
That's
just,
awesome though.
at the same time, I'm trying to create the first biodynamic vineyard in the South. Just like I believe with, if there's a will, there's a way.
Sure.
And if you know your science enough, you can kind of just go step by step, learn your mistakes, try again, keep going. So there's a lot of trial and error in it. But I ended up applying the principles of forced adaptation or evolution to mead, and
Yeah.
it was kind of a fun scientific experiment for me. Something that I thought could kind of bring the industry another step forward in its understanding of how mead works. So it's kind of a challenge that I wanted to see if I could overcome. It's just a weird science thing. I don't know why. I
Oh,
like to just try the impossible and go for it. But it seemed to work out pretty well. And I actually designed a state-of-the-art facility specifically around the ancestral mead. So, I worked
whoa.
on the blueprints. I was designing the blueprints from the time I was in college up until I had enough resources to actually build the facility. So everything about it is designed to be off-grid completely. So there's no sewage system whatsoever. Literally, the
Whoa.
only thing that kills anything in the facility is ozone, which has a half-life around 30 minutes. And so it dissipates into oxygen. So I wanted to be able to use that as my sole provider of energy and of,
Whoa.
killing machine effectively. And in learning about people like, the nuns who produce, natural cheeses and all
Mm-hmm.
these natural wild fermentation scientists. I read a couple books on, from Sandor Katz, who's kind of like the godfather of wild crafting fermentation.
I've
I
heard the
just
name.
learned that if you dive in and you just go all in on wild fermentation, your whole facility just become enwrapped, enthralled, and taken over and enveloped in wild microbes. You actually end up with a protective sort of experience. So like my whole facility is now full of these wild microbes that live on honey. There are no
Yeah.
pathogens because if the pathogen enters my facility, it's going to get quorum sensed to oblivion. Like it's going to get annihilated by what now lives in every crook and cranny of my facility.
Whoa.
Because I've made sure to not create this wasteland. I'm not constantly cleaning and sterilizing. Like we use water. We're just cleaning with
Right.
natural water and ozone. There's no, harsh chemicals or anything. We have a permit to literally put what comes off our facility into our farm because there's no chemical residue whatsoever on anything. So, it's
That's
kind of a
awesome.
lot of it's just been this big tour de force of like, what can we do as naturally as possible, everywhere from the vineyard to the winery, and how do we apply this to mead making? And it's turned out
Yeah.
pretty well.
That reminds me of like, so my wife, we had this really cool fish tank, and she built this like ecosystem inside the fish tank to where it almost didn't need filtration because it was self-sustained. You put the right amount of animals and you put the right amount of things in at the right, ratios and stuff,
Aquaponics.
and you can create this self-sustaining system. And you're doing that inside your meadery with healthy bacteria cultures and yeast microbes and all the things that I'm going to mispronounce and misclassify, but
It's all good.
um, but you basically created a healthy ecosystem inside your meadery for this spontaneous. I use the term spontaneous, just intended fermentation, wild fermentation. I'll call it that. This intended wild fermentation process to continue. I man, that if people don't think that's one of the coolest things ever, I mean, I feel bad for them because I'm absolutely just enamored by this process. I've spoke to two other people, um, recently, relatively recently, that also do spontaneous fermentation. One guy in Great Britain, Simon at the Great British Mead Company, and then a guy in Norway at Marlow Bobo. They both do spontaneous fermentations, and again, I'm just equally as enamored by like the it, just the coolness of it, I guess.
Yeah, it's crazy. It is a lot like aquaponics. When I was in grad school, I actually wrote a grant for aquaponics. So the terrestrial microbiology and how it relates to fish and their nitrate systems. So the creation of nitrites from nitrates and, fixing effectively a nitrogen cycle. So it's kind
Gotcha.
of funny you say that because aquaponics is really related to what I do.
Oh
It's more
wow.
of adapting and creating an ecological cycle within your fermentation, just like an aquaponics setup would be with fish. Yeah.
Oh wow. I'm glad I could at least make a
Yeah,
correlating
I
analogy there.
totally
That's
get that.
awesome. Um, so what other flavors do you make besides? You've got the ancient, and then you said the lavender and the cherry. Do you just make those three, and that you kind of just stick to that, or do you have like a whole catalog of mead that you flavors that you work with?
We have an excitingly expanding category of mead. I think every couple of months we drop something new to try to, open it up a little bit. But there's
Yeah,
two main lines. So I wanted to kind of show the two main lines that we have would be the, biodynamic side, where it's literally raw honey, raw like water from the ground. That's all it is.
yeah.
We'll add, a little bit of lavender for this one. But at the core of it, it's very simplified. So that's our ancestral mead line.
Okay.
We kind of have this fancy, die cut, the old gold foil. We kind of show that it's
Hold it up
more
a
of a
little bit
top tier
closer
product.
so we can see it. There you go.
Yeah,
Yeah,
mead with
that's some really cool
a
artwork.
lavender. Pretty simple, but yeah, just two ingredients plus water. Lavender, raw honey. Just water, honey, lavender. So we talk a little bit. Oh yeah, and here we've
Nice.
got a little section. I don't know if you can read it, but it says chill and allow the stardust to settle.
Yeah.
We call the wild funk as stardust. It kind of lets us get away with it. We've got a little info about how our natural stuff and the
Yeah.
history of the monks in Saint Hilaire who originally made the ancestral method.
Okay.
And then so that's one line, and we got that. We
Yeah.
have a cherry blood. We do a melon style. We have our original
Ooh.
ancestral mead. That's just literally honey and water, two
Yeah.
ingredients. People go crazy when I tell them that. They're like, "What yeast is that?" And then this over here is a different
Proprietary.
line of products. So we got our funky ferments that I mentioned.
Okay.
It's a whole line of products that are all made using the original ancestral mead. We make it the same way initially, but the cool thing is we developed a way to batch process out. So as a business, you want to be really able to be flexible. At the drop of
Hmm.
a hat, if a distributor places an order, we're like, oh man, well, how do we make that really quick? Well, I've got 80 gallons of ancestral. How do
Yeah.
I turn this into these other products? So the cool thing about these, they're half the alcohol. So we're just adding fruit juice, a little sulfite and sorbate combo, to
Yep.
make it to preserve it all.
Stable. Yep.
And effectively, we're just making a bunch of novel products all out of the same ancestral mead. So we're actually
Yep.
using ancestral mead as a base for our funky ferments line. Preserving it, adding fruit juices. This one has maple syrup in it, organic apples, and cinnamon stick. I mean,
Ooh.
why mess with perfection?
Hey man, that's a good combo.
Everybody has one, but it's an easy win for anybody
Yeah.
trying to homebrew. And we're just about to launch our next one. It's called Buzzed Bee. It's a lemon ginger mead. It just hits the spot.
There we
We
go.
actually at our cocktail bar, which is we have a bar that only serves mead cocktails,
Oh.
which is fun. And so we mix this one with Fireball, and it tastes just like a red hot. It's really fun.
Okay.
We don't have a liquor license, so when Fireball got relaunched as a malt version, we
Yeah.
kind of cheated, and we've got a bunch of kind of like cheats for how to make a cocktail bar out of just mead.
Hey, that's
But yeah,
very cool.
yeah, but
I'm on
that's
board with
it.
mead cocktails.
So yeah, we got those two main lines, and now on top of
Okay.
that, we also do honey soda. If you want something easy that's able to hit a wide audience,
Yeah.
frankly, it's of course gotten appropriated as a bourbon mixer because what can you do? That's just as time approaches infinity, everything non-alcoholic becomes
Oh,
a cocktail
I was gonna
mixer.
say, yeah. That creates NA
Yeah.
product, gets used as a mixer.
It's like
Yeah,
a
you
rule of
kind
the
of,
internet or something. I don't know, but so we got honey soda line, and we're starting to branch that out. So we're about to launch a
yeah,
honey cream soda, and
okay.
one of the tricks of food science is just using half the honey and making it a light version. So it's we got a light honey soda as well that's made out of vanilla. It's something more drinkable. The other one's so strong it's more of a good mixer. On top of that, though, I also do a non-alcoholic mead line that's different than honey soda because it's actually fermented, but we're fermenting using kombucha cultures.
Oh,
So
okay.
it's actually a non-alcoholic kombucha culture fermented. It's actually called Jun.
Yeah,
So it's using a culture of yeast. But the marketing ploy is we have this whole non-alcoholic beer movement, the non-alcoholic wine movement, which just sucks. But then the non-alcoholic mead movement hasn't really happened so much. And I think it's really fun to apply like actual
yeah,
living culture fermentation because non-alcoholic drinkers they like something that's healthy. So like the probiotics is like a whole nother level
right.
of a healthier alternative to alcohol. So by simply just flipping on its head and marketing it as an NA drink, but also being like legitimately a healthier fermented drink, it is mead
Yeah,
because it is a fermented honey product. The alcohol is less than 0.5% because these are yeast with a knockout gene for alcohol production, or I guess
right.
highly inefficient alcohol
Yeah,
production.
yeah,
So it's kind of a fun marketing trick that I came up with to try and do some NA meat stuff, just like the NA beer movement has. Unfortunately, it requires refrigeration. It's a little bit more flimsy, but we're
yeah.
working out the kinks right now. I think the next step is ferment it dry and then add some monk fruit or something to sweeten it back up so it doesn't have, I guess you're using non-fermentable sugars.
Right.
So that's kind of the trick up my sleeve I think I'll use for that for the next step. Right now, we're kind of just testing the waters with it, seeing if a distributor wants to pick it up.
The scientist is being a scientist, you say?
It's fun. I
Yeah.
get to play somewhere in the space of creative marketer and scientist. It's a fun
Yeah.
realm. Yeah.
No, I'm here for all of it. Like I said, this is why I wanted to talk to you because you have a unique a unique background and b a unique outlook that a lot of people don't validate, which I think is a really kind of shame because excuse me, a lot of times and again mostly it's in excuse me in like Reddit groups and Facebook chats and stuff. It's or Facebook groups and stuff. You get these like negative ideas and cultures that kind of permeate and seem to take over. And there was, people like, it's like you said, it's uncontrollable is one of the things people say. It's unreliable. As Tony pointed out, there's probably a preconceived notion that you can't, control or even get like a high ABV out of it. And to see that you're smashing all those stereotypes and not
Yeah.
only smashing them, like using science to dictate why it works and why it's a repeatable process. I think there needs to be more of that in mead culture.
Absolutely. I appreciate it. And yeah, I call it a controlled spontaneous fermentation.
Sure,
Because
whatever
it's,
you
it really is
use. I like your
controlled.
term.
Yeah, we have a lot of variables we have to control for.
Hmm.
There's a lot, and I can't tell you all of them, but it is really,
No,
something that is absolutely reproducible. I mean, 6 years of experience doing it every single time, working every single time. And really the biggest trick that I'll tell you all is just the oxygen. You need a lot of oxygen. And, frankly, this is coming from a food microbiologist. This is not coming from all
yeah,
the millions of books you read saying minimize oxygen, because they're just
yeah,
flat out wrong. I mean, they're just completely wrong about it. And it's unfortunately a concept that's pervaded everything. And it comes from the wine world, because in the wine world, everyone's scared about oxidizing their white
yeah,
wine, especially. And I can tell you, mead is extremely tolerant to oxygen. I mean, honey is an antioxidant. You know,
right,
like we have the ability to feed these yeast a lot more with mead making, and I think people need to give up on that fear, and actually embrace the fact that the more oxygen, the better, all through primary fermentation, all the way to the last. I mean, we are stirring all the way down to 2 or 3 bricks. I mean, it is, we go almost all the way through the end with heavy stirring. So, I mean,
yeah.
if that's working for us, I recommend it to everybody else.
How long is it taking you to get through a fermentation cycle from, well, I guess not from, let's call it from must to well, you said you racked multiple times in secondary, so I guess I don't know like what terminology to use. So from start to finish, what's the from tank to bottle?
Yeah, well, I can tell you, we start off with a 1 to 3 ratio, honey to water, and we're stirring
Okay,
like mad, 10 minutes a day or so, and it will go, let's say 35 bricks down to 34, 33, then all of a sudden it starts dropping like 3 or 4 at a time, and then like it just goes boom. I mean, it just tanks the whole thing,
sure.
really in about, it takes about 2 weeks to go from 35 bricks down to about 3 bricks.
Okay.
And when we
Wow,
get,
that's
yeah,
impressive.
with a fully spontaneous fermentation. And then
Yeah.
from there, it takes maybe a week and a half to go all the way down to the 1.5 bricks level that we look at as a time to kind of to get the thing
Right.
slowed down. And we actually pick it up when we put it into a cold room. That's our step of slowing it down. That's part of our design process, physically dropping it. People use glycol and all that, but we have a huge walk-in. It works for us.
Yeah.
And so it drops everything down. It takes, maybe half a day to a day for the yeast to hibernate.
Hmm.
And then 3 days in or so, we'll rack the first time. And then we'll let it settle literally 4 days. And then we'll rack it again, 4 days, rack it again, 4 days, rack it again, bottle, boom, done.
Wow.
And
Okay.
so the entire process, it can be as quick as about a month and a week, for
So just
everything
as
to
fast
go through.
as the guys using the pitched yeast and the Tunsa method.
That's right.
Wow, I am so just fucking impressed by this. This is
Yep.
amazing. Now, do you think was it equally was it just as quick when you first started doing this process and you were first got into this building before you had built this ecosystem for the yeast, or is it something that you've
Uh,
kind of built up to at this point and now you've, got it dialed in, so to speak?
Oh, it's very dialed in. I think the first 2 years, it was more of like a 4 month process to get it down to the bricks level. We didn't,
Right.
and frankly, it was the stirring. It was the stirring that really changed everything for us, because we were like, well, let's, just like with
Right.
wine, like let's gently get it. Let's kind of like mix it up off the bottom, but don't splash too
Yeah.
much. And that was kind of the
Yeah.
idea. and we baby it. We taste a little bit of something going on and be like, oh crap, we got to get more oxygen because it's tasting a little fusel alkali. And like I was just using my wine microbiology concepts to like kind of brainstorm as I went. And so it just was these long, slow, drawn out processes. We were terrified, like just like,
Yeah.
oh man, it's gonna go bad, it's gonna go bad, please don't go sour. The first couple of batches had a little sourness in it. It was like, maybe we'll add something to it, maybe a little honey to like back sweeten it. I don't know. We'll figure it out, or add some fruit to it and figure it out. And
Yeah.
but over the years, it just got to the point where I slowly kind of brute forced my way step by step, like each batch making it a little bit faster. And now, I mean, now it's so dialed in, it's ridiculous. I mean, we can literally go through a fermentation faster than D47 can, which is just kind of wild.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
spontaneous fermentation. And the other thing is we are force evolving. So as you stir, you're dropping out the things that are not as fast as the others, and something gets faster and faster. And there's certain bacteria like lactobacillus, where there's certain strains we have that are growing at 14-15% alcohol, going all the way to the end, no problem. So it actually is a true probiotic.
Yeah.
And there's yeast as well, with the forced adaptation. If you're force evolving something, you think there's an infinite number of strains of tiny little differences between every single little cell, let's say.
Yeah.
You are making an environment where they're all competing, and the winner competes and grows, and these winners compete. And you get to the point where at some point during the exponential growth curve, you have a winner who is better than any yeast that exists on the market.
Right.
Because it is the winner for your environment specifically. It's not the winner for some cave in France. It's not the winner of some,
Right.
Lallemand manufacturing facility. It's the winner for your mead. So I'm not even that surprised anymore, just to see how fast these things take off. Because I mean, we're literally using forced evolution microbiology, a concept that
Right.
really got big in the 90s when people were developing pharmaceuticals and developing different fermented products. It's a concept
Yeah.
that biotech uses. So we're kind of just thinking about it like a biotech company would, where we're using forced adaptation to, instead of genetically engineer something, we're using that to optimize our fermentation. So
It's
I mean, it works.
it's selective breeding without you doing it's natural
Natural
selection.
selection.
You
Yeah.
Charles Darwin is tears rolling down his face, and he's just smiling from beyond. He's just, it's everything I've ever wanted. No, I love
Yeah.
it. My buddy
Yeah.
Tony here had a question about fruit in there, and I definitely want to get back to that some more on the yeast. But he said said I've always gotten really high ABVs with wild fermentations. Any particular type of fruit that has helped you better increase the fermentation? Berries or citrus fruits have spiked fermentation, have spiked the wild fermentations more than other fruits for me.
Yeah, I can speak on that. There's certain fruit I've noticed that are really effective when you add it at boosting a fermentation. I wish they weren't so expensive, but blackberries actually come to mind as probably one of my favorites. A lot of people are
Sure.
scared of them because of how funky and gnarly they are. But there's tons
Yeah.
of gunk and tons of ways for it to actually help promote yeast growth in a quick way. I believe it has a pretty high concentration of nitrogen. It allows it to really kick things off. I found that cherries, honestly, have been really effective for me. And there
Yeah.
is a history of using cherries with fermentation, both in Belgium to make beer, and they make it really fast when they add the cherries as a co-fermentation effectively. But
Yeah.
actually, the Vikings, when they stormed through England, they were getting cherry trees, adding cherries to their meads, and creating these red meads called Viking blood, for example,
Sure.
where they're creating something that is a much faster fermentation. So those fruits, but yeah, I've noticed berries have been just extremely effective. Citrus
Wow.
as well can be, as long as you got your buffer system right. But yeah, in my experience, it's just been blackberries have been just this ultra kind of gut punch when it comes to yeast. They're just ready to take off when you add blackberries.
That's awesome. So blackberries, like you said, are kind of like your what would be like a Go Firm or something like that. They're like your nutrient booster. If
Yeah,
I need something, we throw a little blackberries in there, and boom, away you go. But
yeah.
I mean, you've got your stuff so dialed in already.
It,
You don't
yeah,
you don't
it's
need
kind of
anything
just like
like
a
that.
way. It just means you don't have to add any nutrients, which is
Right.
nice. Not all fruits are going to be full nutrients.
Sure.
Every fruit's going to be different in what it adds, but there's certain fruits that just have everything, the whole complex ready to go, so you don't have to worry about nutes at all. And it's exciting to watch something take off really quick when you have a sluggish or even stuck fermentation. You throw some blackberry in there, it's just like, let's pop. And
Wow.
I found cherries to be pretty similar, honestly. The dark cherries actually a little bit more than the red or the sweet cherries. I don't know why, but the dark cherries have really been a big processing aid for us. So we actually switched to using dark cherries for our cherry blood mead that we do.
You guys use um, skin on whole fruit cherries in that, or
Yeah,
do you
actually,
just juice them,
so
just free
actually
run juice, or?
mashed and blended. So it's a
Mhm.
puree effectively that we're adding.
Have you ever a couple of weeks ago I was talking with that guy over in Norway, and he uses a lot of like carbonic maceration and a lot of like different crazy wild techniques. Do you guys ever mess with anything like that? That's like so on
Nice.
my list of things to try.
Yeah, carbonic maceration would be a blast. I mean, I know it really well from the wine world, but
Yeah.
that's adding something like dry ice to it and really creating a blanket where there's no oxygen, nothing can breathe. But the thing about it is that's not well. I mean, it is a part of microbiology, but you're talking about a non-microbial fermentation, so you're talking about a
Oh,
pure enzymatic fermentation. So that's not super my wheelhouse of what I do. But I do appreciate an enzymatic fermentation. It's pretty cool to think about. But I don't know. I actually have no idea about enzymes in honey and being able to ferment in much of a much or at least do much of anything really.
yeah.
I don't know, but you can do that with fruit. So if you started with fruit, did a carbonic maceration with fruit enzymes are going to degrade and break everything down. Get a fermentation going, add that to your honey, and it would be a pretty interesting experiment. I'd love to see that.
And that's basically what they were doing
Cool.
what I could have gathered from the conversations. They put the fruit it through carbonic maceration,
Yeah,
and
gotcha,
then
gotcha.
add that to the mead once it's or once everything's already going either in primary to something that's already going in primary or again in secondary and get actually true secondary fermentation going.
Nice.
Yeah, I'm here for all the crazy wild
Yeah.
methods and all the really cool stuff. I'm really interested to know how those yeast cultures are going to vary from place to place. Like so, like again, you're in North Carolina. I spoke with a guy in again London or well England area at Great British Mead Company. He does his stuff like outside even for with wild
Mhm.
fermentation. So he's probably not getting the same yeast strains all the time, or even outside, do you think he's been able to help cultivate a particular type of environment?
Well, you're going to have a lot more input, right? If you're going to do everything outside, you're going to have a lot less reproducibility. You're going to have a lot more variation, which could be exciting. For me and the U.S. government, we kind of
Sure.
got the United States does not love outdoor fermentations in general.
Oh, I can
I
imagine.
actually developed my facility to be both FDA and TTB compliant so that we could actually produce sauerkraut,
Oh,
kombucha, things like that as
cool.
well. Yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah.
And the government told me a flat out no, we're not allowed to ferment outdoors because of
Oh,
regulations. So we ended up designing the whole facility to effectively recreate the outdoors in terms of its climate, temperatures.
yeah.
We actually have what we call a winter room, a spring room, and a summer room, which perfectly match the environment of where we are physically, like the exact
Right.
temperatures and environment of the Appalachian Mountains where we are. And I would love to be introducing more wild, but we really focused ourselves on the honey itself and what comes in. And a cool thing about honey is something to keep in
Yeah.
mind. Honey will have the highest level of Saccharomyces cerevisiae, the primary fermentative yeast, based on scientific literature that I've read. It'll have the highest right when it's harvested, like right when it comes out of the hive, extracted, go. If you use your honey within a few weeks and it's local, you just got it, that's when you're going to have the fastest, most effective fermentations. If you wait around for it to crystallize, you'll actually
Sure.
notice a die-off of Saccharomyces. So it's almost like your inoculum, instead of starting off with 10 to the fourth CFUs per mil, it's dying down to like 10 to the 1, 10 to the 2. And so you're really limiting how much
Oh.
starter culture you have. So that's another reason why the terroir works so well. Like we only get our honey very, very locally, like on our mountain, because we
Yeah.
know that yeast is going to be there popping. And it's an indigenous culture to to our land. So that's our terroir. So we do have that outside element, but only in what our bees are capturing and what gets carried on their pollen sacs and delivered into their hive. That's our terroir. So there is this outdoor, incorporation, but there's not an outdoor incorporation of like what comes in on the wind,
Sure.
out of the
Right.
facility necessarily. I mean, of course, we open the doors, whatever. But I'd say the main way we're getting all of our yeast is from the bees and their activity. So, the terroir is the circumference of that region where their bees are flying around. So our terroir is kind of like this interestingly kind of spread out region of where the bees are flying.
Yeah. So you've taken an amalgamation of all the bees and all the terroir that they've brought in and basically turned the inside into a combination of your multiple outside.
Right. Exactly. So it has a kind of a similar end effects, while also having maybe a little bit more control of the environment
Yeah.
to make sure that fermentation is going to pop off the same way most every time. Now, the amalgamation, the cool thing about it is that amalgamation is going to pick up very similar yeast to what eventually will evolve to be, our best yeast in that particular brew. So every time our fermentation ends, it's always ending with whatever yeast are able to evolve a high alcohol tolerance. And those bees are picking up that yeast. They're also picking up a weak alcohol tolerant yeast that maybe tastes really cool. They're picking up a yeast that tastes really cool in that way. Maybe there's a yeast that's really good with splitting esters that like just releases these cool aromatics. It's picking up all of it. And a lot of these yeasts are there and working together, in collaboration until the very end where all our alcohol tolerant yeasts are like, it's our turn. Let's go.
Yeah. No kidding. Now, what are the chances, from a evolutionary standpoint, that your yeast could pick up a less desirable trait, or is that pretty much got to the point to where anything that's going to, like you said, produce fusels or off flavors is pretty much are always deemed negative traits, and you've pretty much evolved past that at this point?
That's a really good question, and I can only say theories on
Sure.
how that works. I think there's certain genetic linkages or
No, I'm sorry. I
certain
need hard
places and
facts.
yeah. I think that there might be certain locations on the genome that might link certain attributes when it comes to yeast. And I think a lot of the positive attributes happen to be linked to survival attributes. And it's just this weird thing. If yeast is happy, it creates these nice, wonderful components. When yeast is unhappy, it creates these undesirables. And the interesting thing is I think every yeast has in their genome the ability to activate these pathways. And so it really seems like yeasts have a very expansive, very long genome. Better than bacteria, yeast have very long genomes. And so like hidden, like almost unexpressed across their genome are all these abilities to create these nasty things or to create these good things. So when you think about a yeast, it actually is good to think that all yeast actually have the ability to be nasty. All yeast could be the worst thing in the world if you hit that pathway it doesn't like. But the cool thing about it is like this species, Saccharomyces, and all of the related genuses, even the non-Saccharomyces yeast, it seems like if you treat them well and you make them happy, they're going to be happy little folks as well. And maybe that delves into things beyond our realm. I don't know if it's like some spiritual thing, like maybe God wants us to be happy. I don't know, man. I don't know what it is. But for some reason, if you treat your microbes right, they treat you right back. And there's just something to learn from that, I guess.
Yeah, I say there's definitely something to be learned from that. Somebody once I had heard it explained. Think about your yeast working hard, like your yeast working like you would work. If you're working hard, you're breaking a sweat, you're not taking care of yourself, you're not hydrating properly, you're not doing what you should do, you're gonna sweat and be all funky and not have a good time. But if you consume enough water and you make sure to hydrate the night before and you make sure to consume all the right nutrients, you can put in a lot of work and you're not going to be nearly as nasty the next day. You're going to still get all the work done, but you're still be a much more pleasant individual. And the same thing seems to be true for yeast.
Yeah, anyone can get nasty. It's true.
Exactly. Anyone can get nasty. I like that. So you got all these, I say all these, you got these two lines and several different products within both of your lines. Do you classify it as a carbonated product for like judging purposes? Because I'm assuming you don't do any posts, like add any priming sugars or anything like that.
Well,
So how do you enter that in competitions?
that's a great question. I can tell you that every time we enter products, we get nasty remarks about how it should have been the other one,
Oh, sure.
because it's always kind of so I'll always write in there if there's an opportunity to have a category that's like lightly effervescent. That's usually what we go for.
Hmm.
But oftentimes we're met with competitions where it's either carbonated or still,
Too flat
and
for
we just
still,
get
too still for
exactly.
flats. Gotcha.
Exactly,
Or
exactly. So we just get
carbs.
angry
Yeah.
letters from everybody, and it's always fun to review the notes, especially, Mazer Cup, for example, where it's like professionals and the meadery that they've owned for the last decade, and they're like, "What is this nonsense? This is not carbonated." And then the other mead that
Yeah.
we do is a still mead. They're like, "What is this? This is not still." So it's kind of funny. And so we've actually been working really hard in North Carolina on
Oh,
getting
wow.
judges or panels to actually increase and broaden out. So now there's actually an effervescent category where it's kind of an in between, a pet nat category, even if that, where you can be really variable and
Yeah.
allow for that and not consider that a fault. So we've been kind of pushing to get natural wine and natural mead its own little category where it can kind of play in the in between space. Because really, I mean, beer plays in the in between space as
Oh,
well.
yeah.
There's a ton.
Absolutely.
Beer is all over the place in carbonation. You wouldn't submit a stout and say it's still. You wouldn't submit a stout and say it's carbonated if you're, in the doing a wine category.
Right.
So there's certain in between beers that are, light carbonation. There's a lot of beers that are spontaneously fermented, bottle conditioned. I mean, there's a lot more
Very
in the beer world. So
true.
why can't we do that in the mead world? I think we're starting to see
It's a good point.
judges notice that and pick that up and see that there actually is a wider, array and blend. Obviously, session meads have blown up in the last few years. So
Hmm.
I think that's going to also kind of start differentiating within itself to like light sparkle, big sparkle, big
Right.
bubbles. And like, I think sparkling is just a very, diverse concept that hasn't really gotten enough understanding in the mead world.
Right. They took it from the wine world and said, we're just going to use this because it exists already.
Right.
And so, if you don't like it, pound sand.
Yeah, the French were like, "This is what champagne is. This is what still wine is. Get with the program."
Yeah.
And
And
here,
if you
here
don't
is the
like our,
play.
if you don't like our, centuries old way of thinking, you can, eat it. No,
Exactly.
and to your point, I agree a lot with that way of thinking. I think a lot of the things from the judging and from, I mean, from like say like BJCP standards, or even different wine standards that are applied to mead when when you enter the wine competitions and stuff. A lot of those things were um, now I don't know all the cats that put together the BJCP standards, but it seems like a lot of those things were chosen from already existing things, even though they were picked from here and there and stuff like that. But I feel that there's people out there that are even trying to change those things, or even I guess they say change those things, but add another option, add a better way, a more defined, a more accurate way of looking at mead. Less wine things in this area, more beer ways in this area, or less wine and beer things at all, and create something all new together in this category or this area. I think in the next 10 years, within the next 10 years, you'll see a whole new um, framework for a judging rubric for mead that fits a lot better than what exists already. I don't know what that looks like quite yet, but I think it's on the horizon.
I agree. I mean, you look at France and they've spent hundreds of years and trillions of dollars on developing terminology, developing standards, developing all of this.
Sure.
Mead has never been given that same
No.
opportunity. I'm also a sensory scientist, so part of my background is developing sensory panels to actually analyze different qualitative and quantitative, aspects of products. I did this in the sparkling wine world for a little while too, and like we've never really had a good PCA or a quantitative or a spectrum method analysis
Hmm.
where people have created trained panels to develop like this specific attribute and really pick it out on like a line graph or hedonistic or hedonist scale. Like there's no or hedonic, sorry, there's no really developed protocols and really developed sensory analyses around mead in the way that wine has for centuries. And so part of that, these people are creating these mead panels out of thin air, and that's really hard to do without a lot of panelist training, a lot of data, and really like
Yeah.
massive, high end numbers for, panelists to really break down and develop what the greater spectrum is. So really our mead panels have all been these, wine people who've been pulled into the mead world and then applying their knowledge of hundreds of years of wine
Yeah.
science and wine sensory analysis to the mead and applying these terms. And you're stuck with mead, you're stuck with all these, analytical or quantitative or qualitative terms that describe wine really well. And so all of our scales with mead are like, how much like wine is it in this attribute? How much of wine,
Yeah.
and at the end of the day, it's a bunch of false data. It's really based on a house of cards. And I think,
Yep.
unfortunately, at some point, we're going to have to press the nuclear button and start from scratch, and just have a very established, well-funded program where we actually develop the terminology for how we talk about meat, because it just hasn't really been done yet.
Yeah, and I agree 100%. I enjoy your methodology of saying using the honey in your local areas, the terroir for the
Mm-hmm.
mead. Like is that same. I guess it kind of goes back to that French concept of wine and everything like that. But even that is something that I've, and correct me if I'm wrong, I feel that you kind of lean that way because it's a concept that is recognizable to people and it's something that's easily explained, as opposed to trying to create something, this whole new category, this whole new concept that
Mm-hmm.
would be foreign to many people, even many people within the meat community that are already familiar with the product.
Exactly. I mean, really, it comes down to marketing. I know my clientele. I know I have a natural wine clientele.
Right.
A natural wine clientele, they buzz around at that word terroir. I mean,
Oh
they're
yeah,
like, wait, terroir,
it's a
mead?
big
What,
buzz.
what? Yeah, add that to my cart. Let's go. And, I'll steal terms from beer world for the same reason. I'll be
Oh,
like, yo, I
absolutely.
love sessionable meads. Like, that's totally stealing from the beer world. I'm going
Right.
to give them credit where it's due, and it's
Yeah.
important
Everybody
to
sells session meads. Nobody sells petulant hydromel.
I know, right? It sounds silly, but you got to know like your audience for things. Like the beer audience connects, they jive with that session concept, just like the wine folks, they
Yeah.
jive with the words like biodynamic, with terroir, with those kinds of
Hmm.
concepts. So really mead right now, we're like playing off of those two, kind of that spectrum of whether it's wine or beer crowd that you're hitting. And frankly, if
Right.
I'm driving to, a city where I know natural wine sells, I start talking about terroir and all this. If I go to
Yeah.
a beer place, I start saying, oh yeah, spontaneous fermented, bottle conditioned. Like, dude, what? Like bottle, nobody says that in the wine world. But I use that when I'm in a beer, like if I'm in Charlotte, North Carolina, you bet your butt I'm talking about beer terminology, and so it really,
Right.
you need to know the demographics when you talk mead, because we just don't have our own terms. And even if we did, it's going to take decades for those terms to get into the cultural dialect of where we are.
Right. Well, I think that's actually kind of the beauty of mead. It's all of these things and none of these things at the same time. So it gets to be, greater than the sum of its parts. It's not just a beer thing. It's not just a wine thing. It's not just a mead thing. It's all of these things in ways that, most beer and wine and even cider and stuff can't be. There's no other product is adjunct the way that mead is. I guess some people like to say that pastry stouts could probably fall into that category, maybe like kettle sours or something, those smoothie sours. But mead is in a realm unique unto itself, as far as I'm concerned, in the adjunct world.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And the processing is very unique if you really get into it. A
Yeah.
lot of people like to make it like a beer, make it like a wine, but
Hmm.
if you develop your own practice, it really can be a completely different concept. And yeah,
Yeah.
if I walk into a place that has a cider tap, I'm like, hey, cider taps can be replaced by mead, right? Gluten free.
Exactly. Gluten free right falls right into that category. Well, it's not vegan friendly like cider, but it is what it is at that
Whatever.
point. Exactly. Now, we are coming up on the 1 hour mark from when we officially got started and
Cool.
everything like that. Do you have some more time to
Oh, yeah,
join me tonight, or?
no problem. No problem. I got all night.
Awesome. So one of the things I wanted to ask you, if we can roll back into the
Mhm.
yeast and your yeast environment, your yeast ecosystem you created there. Now, have you ever gone out and had your yeast strain, I don't know what the correct term, DNA checked, classified? Like,
Sequence.
do you know if it's like an ale sequence? Thank you.
Mhm.
Is it an ale yeast? Is it a Kveik strain? Like, what kind of yeast are you working with there? Do you even know?
Excellent question. And so right now, I actually have been developing a conference called the Beekeepers and Mead Makers Conference to try and get more students involved in research in the field of mead. If
Yeah.
someone spends 10 minutes in a room with me, I'll give them 20 different thesis topics. So I've actually been holding off on getting it sequenced. Like I could literally just spend some money and get it sequenced, but I've been really holding off to see if I can get an intern
Oh,
or somebody, especially like a graduate student who might want to do get some publications under their belt. Because
yeah.
I just really want it to be, like when we first started working on it, I want it to be an educational thing.
Yeah.
And like I could do it myself, and no problem, it'd be fun. But I've done it so much in my life, I really want to mentor a student and get them involved. So I've actually been holding
So
off because
cool.
I really want someone to be able to do their thesis work on it, because I
Yeah.
think it would be a super fun opportunity. So I'm actually for the conference, I'm presenting and going to all the universities around the state, talking to the professors, getting them out to talk, and
Yeah.
trying to get students to do poster presentations and do little speakership, opportunities to get them involved. So I've been holding off on that one because I just don't want to ruin somebody's project.
No, dude, think that's awesome.
Yeah.
I don't know how long you've been doing it. I'm sure you know who UC Davis is out in
Yep.
California.
Yep. That
You
was the
could,
first school I ever got
oh,
into when I was a
okay,
kid. My mom told me not to do it.
of
Here, get this. My
course,
mom told me UC Davis, don't do it because you're never going to get a job. She was like, no, but you can't, like winemaking, you're never going to get a job that way. So she steered me towards UC Santa Barbara, where they had a really good
right,
biochemistry program. So I went biochemistry, and then of course I was like, yeah, mom, you can't tell me what to do. I ended up as a winemaker anyways. But
right.
what do you
Well, I
know?
just figured UC Davis would be another avenue to be able to pitch your idea for potential grad students. But I think that's
Absolutely.
really it. I think that's a really cool concept and a very you know, awesome way to to help incorporate somebody science, to do a hybrid of people who are science related that may be kind of not knowing what discipline they want to take further their, I don't know what the correct terms are, how to further their discipline and kind of more focus it,
Mhm.
and leaving that as an option for somebody, because you're there as to be able to mentor them because you've done it, you're there to be able to help them with anything. Dude, I think that's really awesome. I kind of wish I was a grad student looking for a mentor, because that sounds like a really
Yeah.
um, a really fun experience. Yeah, and I'm here for it. Now, that being said, can you hypothesize about what you think it may be? I know you scientists like to
Mm.
hypothesize about stuff.
Mm. I mean,
I'm trying to go
honestly, I
back to
think
my high
it's
school science brain here.
I think if I was to guess, we're going to
Yeah.
be watching a massive trend happen. So as fermentation's going, you're going to go, with tons of different bacteria and yeast, but there's going to
Yeah.
be majorities, right?
Sure.
There's going to be majorities of what is dominant. However, the dominant is actually going to share its space with a few sub, yeast and sub bacteria, and it's actually going to fluctuate. So what you're going to see at the beginning, I think, is actually a dominance of ale yeast, and actually bread yeast, and then ale yeast, and they're all going to go into the background a little bit as the
Really?
alcohol concentration starts building and the gluconic acid starts building. So at the same time as those yeast are going, you also have a small amount of bacteria. So the lactobacillus, especially, I like to bring up that one a lot, but the bifidobacterium and lactobacillus are actually indigenous to raw honey. These are both in kombucha. These are the most effective probiotics. If you take supplements, you'll probably see them on the back of a label somewhere. Those are actually living in the honey. So you're going to have a little bit of bifidobacterium, a little lactobacillus, bread yeast, ale yeast, a little wine yeast in there, kind of doing its thing. As gluconic acid gets produced by lactobacillus, what I'm guessing, hypothetically, you're going to start seeing the acid profile change. So the pH is going to start dropping, and you're going to start seeing yeasts that are a little bit more acid tolerant, most specifically wine yeast. That's usually what I think of when I think of, really low pH yeast that dominate. And on top of that, you're going to see alcohol go up. And as alcohol goes up, your bread yeast start going like, a little iffy.
Yeah.
Your ale yeast goes like, oh, I can do it. And they're like, I can't do this. And they start backing down. And then your bifidobacterium is like, I'm out of here. And then,
Yeah.
so your lactobacillus is, and your wine yeast are kind of the last holdouts, really, in the domination. So what's going to happen is your lactobacillus is going to go from like 1,000 strains down to 20 strains. When you start getting to 14%, you're down to 3 strains. That's just from scientific literature about lactobacillus tolerance. There's only three
Okay.
strains of lactobacillus that can survive that far. So I know I've got those in there for my probiotics. But then the wine yeast, I think, is what really starts annihilating out the last bits of sugar and really carries you at the end. So it's actually a fun mix. And if you watch
Yeah.
wild fermentations go, you can actually
Dude.
watch it kind of in real time, kind of grow and sway. And it's a beautiful thing. You kind of get to see the ins and outs of microbiology and how fermentation works. Actually, I've
Yeah.
done a lot of research in that field. Actually worked in tobacco science for a hot minute, doing dip
Whoa.
fermentations. Go figure. So I actually got to watch in real time different colonies, bacteria, and yeast kind of grow and change in the fermentation as certain other yeasts and bacteria produce different acids and different components. So that's kind of where I'm basing that thought on. That you're actually going to see this hugely manipulated. I mean, the environment itself is being changed as certain yeast and bacteria dominate and ferment. And so that environment, when you change environments, it's going to shift who dominates.
Whoa.
So you're kind of like passing off this gauntlet from one colony, one style, one genus even to
Yeah.
another. And your non-Saccharomyces yeast maybe will kick butt from 0 to 4%, start dying off by 7% alcohol. Your ale yeast starts dying off around 9-10%. Your wine yeast just kind of carries the gauntlet all the way to the end.
Yeah.
But that's my theory. I really don't want to do the research and do the actual thing until I have someone I can mentor, because I really
Sure.
want to see this, a publication around it. I don't want to be the only person doing it.
Dude, that is so cool. I'm picturing this like like a relay race or something, where they're passing the baton on, the
Mhm,
like you said, the bread yeast started off, and they hand it off to the ale yeast, who hands it off to the more high tolerant yeast, and
mhm,
each lap it gets a little bit higher, and like you're saying too, you visually can see the fermentation happening. It moves in this particular way during this yeast fermentation, and it shifts and kind of does this thing, and then these and this, and it's like a visual representation. Okay, I know it's moving this way, so now I can see it's at this stage or this part of its evolution and fermentation. Dude, this is the awesomest, nerdiest conversation I've had in so long. I am so
mhm.
excited for this.
Good. Someone actually just asked a fun
Yeah,
question about
yeah,
Brettanomyces in Mead. I wanted
yeah,
to bring that
yeah,
one up just because my
yeah.
my
Please
thesis was actually
do.
on Yeah, my thesis was on Brettanomyces. Like specifically, that was the main one of the main grants I got funded was on Brettanomyces research in wine, and
Yeah.
part of its needs, vitamin needs, are actually pretty complex. It actually feeds on p-coumaric acid and some phenols that are present in red wine specifically. The other interesting thing is they primarily live off of wood lignin components, actually like cellulose components. The Brettanomyces is the only yeast that we know of that can digest wood down, break up the lignin into minor
Oh,
components, pull out the phenolics in it, start eating the phenolics, which is just crazy, and then just
oh,
break it down, break it down, break it down. And that's one of the reasons why we actually, there's a lot of cool science right now in the field of Brettanomyces in energy engineering. So actually
oh,
using woody components like different earth materials and converting it into usable energy. So like ethanol production, for
yeah,
example. So we're actually there's some potential for Brettanomyces in that field. Now, what's interesting is all of that research and knowledge I have of Brettanomyces is tied up into these vitamins and these components that are really based around wood, around certain phenolics in wine. I'd imagine there's some phenolics, and Brettanomyces is one of the most evolved yeasts on the planet. It's actually incredible. Read up on
oh,
Brettanomyces. It's a beautiful thing. In beer, it has certain, biochemical pathways. In wine, it has different biochemical pathways. So, I would imagine that there's a lot of favorable components that can get brought out if it starts metabolizing certain things. So, like in beer, it's used as this cool, kind of interesting phenolic presentation. Kind of this, it's like an earthy sort of note. In wine, it can taste like Band-Aids, or horse sweat is another favorite of mine, and a lot
oh,
of these really nasty terms. So literally, it comes down to what you have, what ingredient you have. So when you ask about
whoa,
whether Brettanomyces Brettanomyces would have any effect in mead, I would imagine that it really depends on what your initial ingredients are. I actually don't know what in honey and water, what that turns out in. So actually, I'm curious. I'm sure somebody on here already has done that before, tried it. But if you
Yeah.
start adding fruits into your batch, the fruit itself is going to completely change the profile of what Brettanomyces will do. In my opinion, it's the most evolved alien on the planet. Let's
Yeah.
see here. Russian River uses Brettanomyces in their sours. Yeah, it's used really extensively in the brewing industry, and only by a few
Yeah.
crazy folks in the wine industry. I've met a couple of them, and they're nuts. But I love what they're doing. There's a few in France that I know of. But I would love to see more research into that because Brettanomyces is a beast. If you use a different starting batch, a different starting culture, sorry, a different mix of nutrients or
Yeah.
ingredients, you're going to have a completely different end result. So if somebody who doesn't also make wine want to mess with it, someone other than me, in their facility, please
Yeah.
go ahead. But I make red wine, so I'm terrified of
Yeah.
Brettanomyces. I love it because I wrote my thesis on it, but it is a terrifying yeast if you make wine, in your
Yeah.
facility.
Well, and
Yeah.
now there's something that, I guess kind of goes back to, your ecosystem that you have built there. Is there
Mhm.
any legitimate fear of invasion from outside species coming in, being brought in from people on their clothes or, outside, what's the term? Invasive species, so to
Yeah.
speak?
Absolutely. That's a huge concern for most folks. For myself, I actually have a theory that I have things like pediococcus in my batches. I think I have different mixes of these spoilage
What's
microbes.
pediococcus
Um,
before you get too far?
yeah, it's a pretty gnarly wine spoilage yeast that can
Oh,
make your like really change the chemistry of your wine, make it taste really nasty, like medicinal almost. There's also Lactobacillus plantarum. That's a really fun one. So it's a version of Lactobacillus that'll create a stringy culture. So it'll make these really long strains of bacteria that'll actually change the texture of your wine, get really weird on you. So there's some spoilage bacteria out there that you just do not want to mess with. But I actually think I have it. I think I have all of them. I don't
yeah,
control for any of them. I don't kill anything. Literally it'll live. The thing is, if you outcompete, you win. The
right.
other concept is if you outcompete through speed and you create something we call in the wine microbiology world nutrient desert, where you have eaten everything that bacteria or that yeast could eat, and you outcompete it. You grow faster, way faster than they could. You end up not only eating all their nutrients, but you're also, taking out its ability to grow, not just from nutrient deprivation, but from things like quorum sensing. So these bacteria, these yeast, are producing tiny little they're little organic chemistry compounds where when there's enough of them, it actually tells other bacteria and other yeast to stop multiplying and stop growing. It's a pretty novel
Well,
concept developed around the
huh.
2000s or so, but it is a big part of fermentation science. And like it doesn't matter what bacteria it is, it'll talk to every mold, every yeast, everything. So it's almost like there's these radio frequencies that we don't know about, we can't really see. But research is starting to unveil that as they grow and the colonies get larger, they tell other bacteria, hey, watch out, I'm the big kid on the block. And if you're doing that
Whoa.
to things like Pediococcus or L. plantarum, they'll get terrified. They'll just be like, okay, I'm just going to hold off with these few cells. So I think there's actually cells of everything in our culture. Brettanomyces maybe also. There's probably Brettanomyces in our batch as well. Just we're
Sure.
able to outcompete at such a fast speed and not provide it any nutrients it requires,
Yeah.
that I think we're just able to outcompete and there's no issue. So as long as you keep in mind, like it's almost like all or nothing. Like it's either you kill everything, you go sterile, like just really meticulous. If
Right.
Brettanomyces comes in, set
Scorch
a
the
fire
earth.
to the building and try to collect the insurance on it. Like it is just like or or you go the opposite direction like I do, and just like everything is welcome here. Like we are inclusive as inclusive gets. Like even the weirdos, like
Right.
everything is here. Like the pediocat, everything.
Right.
Probably some bread, but we're out competing every single time, and it's never been an issue. And I bring in some weird stuff into the facility. The
Yeah.
only time it's ever been an issue is when I try to make kombucha inside the facility,
Ooh.
and I think
Yeah.
kombucha and jun actually grows faster than yeast than traditional ale and wine yeast do. So
Gotcha.
that teaches you jun culture is the fastest growing growing thing I've ever worked with in my life.
Oh,
It will take your honey and turn it into a non-alcoholic probiotic culture like that. And so I brought
wow.
it in, tried it once inside the lab and or inside the facility, and the tanks around it started growing these little squid inside of it. They look like little squid floating around, or jellyfish, sorry, floating around. And you're like,
The mother's
oh
starting.
no. But we
Yeah.
tried it once. I think someone was drinking a kombucha in the facility, and like literally that started a couple buckets off. So like if something can grow faster with what you have, your ingredients, then you are done for. You just want what's growing faster to be something good. So I would recommend
Yeah.
not drinking kombucha in your winery.
No kidding. I had one of the guys that I know is a commercial mead maker in Arizona. Ended up bringing in. He was trying to say expand his production, his repertoire, and brought in a kombucha, and ended up accidentally, I guess, sucking it through his filter press.
Oh,
Oh, and I guess it was a gigantic mess trying to get it out of the filters and whatnot, and just created this giant absolute mess. But I work for a place that we make vinegar and stuff, so I'd always thought about we make vinegar from red wine and white wine, rice wine, apple cider, all sorts of different things. I always thought it'd be interesting to see what some like mead wines some honey wines would turn into as far as vinegar base goes.
yeah, that's what's in my kitchen right now. I use I have mead vinegars that are
Oh,
just from old buckets I
wow.
left out for too long, and then just kind of poured them in bottles, and it is amazing. I've had sake vinegar as well, also fantastic. Yeah, mead vinegar is delicious. The honey notes, just I put it on like a sesame
Yeah,
salad, and it's bomb. I
yeah,
highly recommend. Yeah, I mean literally just make some buckets, throw it outside for a little while, and just bottle it off. You're good to go. It's delicious. Just let it just sit there in a bunch of oxygen for a long time. The acetobacter from the flies or fruit flies will just get into it
yeah.
eventually, and it'll just start vinegarizing. And it is a fantastic salad addition. Absolutely. Someone's asking about quorum sensing. That's
Yeah.
QUORUM sensing. Quorum sensing. Look that up. Read up on it. It's a really cool topic. Applies to everything from terrestrial microbiology to pathogens, disease-causing agents, as well as applying it to fermentation science.
Awesome. Yeah. Quorum sensing. Now that is again completely something a new concept I've even heard
Yeah.
something. Can you expand on a little bit of how that works?
Absolutely. So it's really cool. It's a really new science. So it hasn't really hit the mainstream totally yet.
Yeah.
But it's tiny little organic. I mean, these are the tiniest little particles. Like we're talking like a methylated group, like little OH group, like just little tiny groupings. And it could be like a little acetyl group, like little tiny components. But every little organic acid that or organic chemical component has its own unique design. So that specific component like is kind of indicative. Like Lactobacillus plantarum will have its little signal. Saccharomyces will have its little signal, and they'll just be shooting them out. And the reason it
Yeah.
took so long for us to find out that this existed is because these particles are so tiny. They don't come
Oh,
up in a natural, in a mass spec or anything. It's too small. Like you wouldn't find it in your chromatography. And if you did, it would literally look like just a white noise signal. Like it would be at the beginning of your chromatogram. So you would never really pick it up and look at it. So for decades and decades, when we were using spectrophotometry and chromatographs, we were just not really looking at that section of the white noise, and so eventually there's some really cool scientists that ended up just picking it apart, the white noise, and they
yeah.
found that the white noise changed depending on what kind of culture you were working with. And so
Oh,
eventually they found out about biofilms and how biofilms were actually affected by quorum sensing, and it would convince a culture to actually create a biofilm if it felt like it was the dominant species through interacting with these little tiny particles, like these little organic chemistry particles, and that it's like an unspoken language
whoa.
between all bacteria, all life forms, and it's really interesting because if you think about it, mushrooms are doing this, trees are doing this through mushrooms. So mushrooms are acting like its own form of quorum sensing, and they talk between
Yeah.
the trees for their own chemicals. And then you take an even bigger step back, the animal kingdom. It's just like hormones. Like we're interacting through pheromones, just like bacteria and yeast are acting through these quorum sensing mechanisms. And ours are a little bit larger. Hormones are a little more
Sure.
complex. But the concept still remains the same. So actually, every single kind of dominion of all life has some sort of language that it uses that's not, that's kind of unusual. It's kind of something that we don't even notice. It literally acts on our own receptors, and our receptor, we're receiving them, but we might not even be consciously aware. So it's pretty fascinating. And yeah, it could be argued that the pellicle that forms is actually related to quorum sensing. So actually, that's a pretty cool point right there.
Yeah, that's something neat to think about because,
Hmm?
like you were saying, you guys blend yours or stir your meads it up until how long before you guys
Almost,
rack it the first time?
yeah, pretty much up till the last day, almost the last day, before when it gets down to maybe 2 bricks or so. And I'm sorry, I don't use beer terminology. I'm a wine guy, but around two
No, that's
percent
fine.
sugar, and that's gonna, right up until the end. And for the last, going from 2% to 1%, when you start, it's really, you sense it. You look at the bubbles, you hear the bubbles, you kind of smell and feel the carbon dioxide. If you still feel the carbon dioxide coming off of it, and you'll know because you'll black out and hit the floor. Um, you'll you'll know you'll know if there's a lot of carbon dioxide coming off of it. And if there is, you're
Oh
fine.
yeah,
You can keep stirring. If there's no carbon dioxide, there's no blanket of carbon dioxide, and it's invisible. So you literally have to like smell it. I put my ear to it so I don't die.
yeah,
But you'll
yeah.
listen for it, and that's how you know that it's safe to keep stirring. If you don't feel that there's a carbon dioxide blanket, it's time to put the lid on, put the airlocks on, put it somewhere to store long term, because that's when you start having oxygen penetrating through the blanket. And you don't want it to sit without a blanket. Like, you're good to splash it and build up the yeast colonies momentarily for like 10 minutes or so.
Sure.
But if you let there be no blanket, you're going to have acetobacter start doing its thing, turning it into vinegar, a lot of spoilage bacteria and all that. So that blanket is your safety net. That's why I like to call it a blanket.
No, I think that's a phenomenal way of thinking about it because I've often wondered why. Again, now I've only been in the mead world, whatever you want to call it, for a very short period of time, 4 years or so. Um, why I don't come across more oxygenated meads. It's really rare for me, even going out of my way to seek some lesser meads. I cruise through homebrew competitions for subpar meads because that's I've been told, homebrews are where you can find those. Not to bash on homebrewers, but that's kind of just the how it's what it's been known. And I don't really see a lot of oxidization in the mead world from berry meads. I mean, outside of say like the Polish styles, like a Druniak or a Truniak, where that's like intentional and it becomes where the sum is greater than the part of its whole, the parts of its whole. Like is that? Do you think because the honey it increases that antioxidant the antioxidants and the microbes protect it from oxidization, or do you think it will eventually if you stir the shit out of it, you're gonna get oxidization?
Well, that's a great question. You will get oxidation to anything that you're producing if there are components that can become oxidized, and that's something that's kind of complicated for most folks to pick up on.
Hmm.
Mead is
Really?
not the same as mead and wine are different enough that there's components in wine that are readily accepting of free radicals of oxygen, whereas mead might have less components. So the
Sure.
same amount of time with oxygen exposure will actually have two different results depending on whether it's wine or mead.
Gotcha.
So it's kind of interesting. So the I would say the potential for oxidation, oxidative potential is actually going to be different depending on what you're starting with in your materials. On
Sure.
top of that, you're going to have a different level of antioxidants in wine and mead. I mean, if, for example, white wine versus red
Yeah.
wine has tons more antioxidants than white wine. Red wine is a lot more play. Like when I'm making my red wine, I'm foot stomping, basket pressing, like literally by hand. I'm gravity feeding, pouring buckets down on top of a wooden basket press and just smashing the thing all over the place.
Right.
And it doesn't even matter. I mean, it doesn't matter even when I'm done with primary fermentation because it has a pretty good amount of play. You'll taste a lot of Italian wines where they go all in on just like splashing the thing everywhere to get that oxidation to happen because they want a little
Right.
bit. and it actually takes a lot of work to get oxidation in your wine. Now with white wine, it doesn't have as much antioxidants. White wine's not as good for you as red wine when it comes to anti-carcinogenic properties,
Sure.
and it's because it just has a lot. It doesn't have protective antioxidants. So even with wine that has relatively the same amount of potential for getting oxidized, there's things that prevent it. And the cool thing about honey, it's a known antioxidant. So you're actually grabbing on, and what an antioxidant is effectively when oxygen comes in, it's going to grab it, it's going to bind to it, it's going to maybe manipulate it a little bit, but it's got a lot of little binding sites for oxygen. When it comes in, it's going to grab it, whatever, and
Yeah.
that way those antioxidants prevent that. The oxygen is going to hit those antioxidants first because it just, I don't know, it has the good receptor sites for it, and so the oxygen's not going to penetrate stuff that maybe will create those off flavors. So you'll notice the more honey you use, the more antioxidants you'll have, the less oxidized stuff's going to get. Now, the style with Poland in a lot of places,
Yeah.
they try and get more oxidation because they actually really enjoy it. When someone mentioned potassium metabisulfite, that is one of the
Yeah.
most effective antioxidants known to man. That thing will bind the heck out of oxygen. So you add a little sulfite to it, and you're not going to have much oxidation. I mean, white wine's pretty protected once you add sulfites to it. So that's, sulfite is a
Gotcha.
massively effective antioxidant. But yeah, with mead, I don't ever use sulfites except for as a final finishing step, just to make sure it doesn't explode, because I don't like lawsuits. If I have something really sweet, I had to buy someone a TV once. It only happened one time, and I actually think it was the glass fractured. There was an issue with the glass itself, because it's never
Oh.
happened since. But I have bought someone a TV, but that's it. And I like to keep it that way.
Fair
But
enough.
that's the only time I use sulfites. So I don't use sulfites in primary, absolutely. I don't use it in secondary. I don't use it during
Oh
racking.
yeah.
It was just kind of surprising. People think during racking there's no protective blanket anymore. But I'm
Oh
keeping it
yeah.
cold, racking it from tank to tank. Don't add sulfites at all during that step, because honey naturally has enough antioxidants. It really doesn't have any issue. My need for oxidants is pretty minimal. Now, when I'm making white wine, I can only rack it once or twice for my natural whites, and I just accept a little cloudiness, because if I get to the third or fourth racking, that white wine's going to be oxidized. My red
Yeah.
wine, I don't use sulfites unless I absolutely have to, and that's only if it comes in with a bunch of acetobacter or a bunch of rot, and you can tell, and that you'll have to use a little sulfites then. But
Sure.
I'm very minimalist. You really don't have to use a lot of sulfites in winemaking, unless you want a super clear white wine, and then you have to have some antioxidant capabilities. You're screwed. With mead, I mean, I could probably rack the thing 10 times and not have any real oxidation. But if you want some oxygen, you can splash it around, pour it from vessel to vessel, just do the whole thing in
Really
a
get
big
it.
vat. And that's how you make a cool oxidized style of mead. And that is a style in Poland, and a few other places.
Yeah.
It's not really my cup of tea exactly, but my process never really hits that much oxidation.
Yeah. No. I'm getting sorry. I got caught up in the beer conversation about oxidized beer. So yeah, why beer oxidization in beer isn't really a concern. I'm assuming it's because the
Not
vast
really.
majority of beer is designed to be drank in quickly as opposed to or sooner. There's a handful of styles that are can be barrel aged and stuff, but I think the vast majority of beer is a younger consumed product, so it's not really a concern.
Well, it's kind of a mix. That is true for a lot of cases, but there are a lot of aged, cask aged or barrel aged beers that last long term, and that goes back to the argument that there's not a lot of oxidizable, components in beer
Mm,
compared to wine. So
sure.
beer you can just let sit in a wooden cask for years, and your only real concern is the oxygen's going to allow for some, oxygen happy spoilage bacteria to start kind of funkifying it a little bit. Now, the cool thing about beer is they have gone all the way through on the thing and are like, sour is fun, sour is great, funk is great. So they're like, they own it, so they'll have those three
Jester
years
King.
spontaneous fermented. Yeah, Ginger King comes to mind, absolutely. Let's let it sit in the barrel. Let's mix 7 different barrels together from different years with all their own, things, and they just throw it all together with all their own funks, and it doesn't matter. It's really not oxidized, because,
Right.
gluten or grain or whatever, grain it doesn't really oxidize the way that wine does. It doesn't have the same kind of components that get knocked
Gotcha.
out with it. So yeah,
So as long as you avoid like your big, you know, your like you said, your oxidatables, oxidatables, your
yeah.
cherries, your berries,
Mhm.
your more fruit things like that. Those things are more subject to the oxidization. because like grapes as well. Apples probably seem to be. I mean, they seem to get like funky with
They'll
color
oxidize.
with oxidization, but the flavor doesn't seem to change much. At least not in the negative like it does with like grape wines and stuff.
The best,
At least
the
in my
best
opinion.
cider, the best cider out there is oxidized. So if you crush your
Oxidizable.
apples and then you let
Thank you,
it,
Squeezy.
yeah, if you crush your apples and you let it sit for a couple of days, it'll start to brown. And
Yeah.
if you then press your apples, you'll have juice that actually is oxidized. But the thing is, oxidation. There's an infinite number of things that oxidation can do. Oxidized apples is actually delicious. If you oxidize your apples, press that juice, and and then carbonate it up, it makes the best cider I've ever had. I used to live in Washington for a minute, and somebody
Oh
showed
wow.
me that trick. I'm like, oh my God, it makes the best cider in the world.
What part of
Yeah. So
Washington? I'm from Washington.
Washington State University in Pullman.
Oh, go Cougs.
Yeah, I know, man. Wazoo. Yeah, that's where I did my graduate research.
Oh, very cool, man.
Yep.
Pullman,
That's
Washington. Some of the
right. Eastern.
best drinking times of my life over in
That's
Eastern Washington.
when you're surrounded by wheat fields, what else are you gonna do, man?
Dude. There's actually a meadery over in that part of Washington. I don't know if they were open. Hierophant when you were over there.
I don't remember visiting Hierophant. I'm not sure.
They were
I
actually
might
in
know enough
Mead,
about it.
Washington.
I'll have to check it out next time I'm there.
Uh,
I don't know if I'll ever be there again, but I might.
Unfortunately, they had two locations. That one closed down. They actually moved to the Western Washington. But
That's all right.
I digress. No, that's freaking awesome, man. I'm a huge cider fan. Like,
Hmm.
I I strongly detest the like grocery store commercial ciders, and maybe you could help me with this. Is because they always taste like cider that's gone foul, like in the fridge. Like I had a bottle of apple juice that went sideways and it's starting to turn, and it feels like a lot of those, like the strong bows and the angry orchards, they have that kind of more um turned apple juice rather than fermented. Like, 'cause, I've had many craft ciders that are like, wow, this is a really cool product. It maintains the apple character, and it has like that unique fermentation character as well, but it doesn't give me that like that sour turned apple juice. What is it that is there something that like discerns the two, or am I just unique?
No, they're definitely different. A lot of the major commercial manufacturers of cider, they're doing a very fast fermentation on it. You're not developing it. You're not creating a protective barrier as well. You're not going to have anything that's going to eat a lot of the components, a lot of the oxygen. You're left with kind of like an apple juice that's been quick fermented. Really, I think the biggest thing is not giving it enough time to age and allow the apples to actually, I mean, the oxidation actually is a pretty necessary step in producing quality cider, in my opinion. So these are all very quick, fermented, quick pressed apples. So your flavor is going to be a little different. The other thing is they're very light. They're using, crisp green apples mostly. These flavors really, you can actually taste the preservatives that they're throwing in it. So that's another thing. They're really overshooting their preservatives they're adding. In the wine world, the minimalist sulfite approach really minimizes how much flavor of sulfite and how much flavor of benzoate and all this is added. These big macro commercial organizations, they're not really bothering with adding how much is appropriate. They're only interested
Gotcha.
in way over, like they're way overshooting their chemical ads because they don't even want to play ball with risking it. There's no minimal
Right.
intervention mindsets with them. So it's like you don't get a lot of flavor because you're not oxidizing your apples. And I think that's coupled with the
Gotcha.
fact that you're over adding your chemical additions because you just don't
Yeah.
care. So I always get like this metallic flavor, this kind of like weird kind of like I don't know, this just weird chemical flavors that don't really seem like
Yeah.
a nice crushed apple. That's my
Right. And yeah,
thought.
that
I'm not a pro at apples, but
no, and well, it makes a lot of sense what you're saying. It's the big guys get to take certain steps and take certain leisures, that smaller guys can't afford because they have the volume. It's just going to be, hey, we're going to stick this stuff out the door. People are going to buy it because we pump commercials out at them and they see it on TV and in the magazines or whatever. So they see Angry Orchard, so they'll buy Angry Orchard.
right.
It just sucks because there's such higher quality product, typically locally, in most cases, say locally, say within the state, that produce something that you could probably find even in a grocery store that's not, or at a local gas station that's not like an Angry Orchard, or you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
There's an equally comparable local product to a national product.
Right. Absolutely. Someone's asking
So
me really quick, what kind of wine's my favorite to make? My favorite
yeah.
wine to make is a blended co-fermentation red wine that's minimal intervention. I have an example of it. I call it Corazon de Castillo. It's using Tempranillo, Grenache, Carignan, and Syrah grapes. A co-fermentation is really exciting because when you do a wild co-fermentation, it's using the starting materials of each grape, combining them into really unique properties you wouldn't get out of a single grape. And I do it all gravity feed, so I'm actually foot stomping everything and then pouring it into a wooden basket press, rationing it down, taking the juice from it, and then pouring it into one of my vessels, my egg-shaped fermenters, and letting it finish off the last few bricks in that fermentation vessel. I then age it. I do a Reserva and a Gran Reserva version. So Gran Reserva is actually, I do a 5. So I borrow from the Spanish lexicon. So I do a Crianza, I do a Reserva and a Gran Reserva version. So that's 3 years in barrel. I do a 5-year in barrel, and I do a 5-year barrel and 2-year in bottle for my Gran Reserva. So I like to go kind of hard on my red wines.
No
And
shit.
yeah, it's really fun. So I love making red wine. White wine's fun, is a quick and easy. I also really like a Cellars Chardonnay. I flip it on its head, and I use yeasts that are really low producers of diacetyl, but they help form kind of this creamy mouthfeel. And I've always enjoyed a good Cellars kind of wild ferment because it's pretty wild, funky, and it's good white wine. And yeah, we do have Vino Shipper online, Stardust Cellars, to answer that
Yeah,
guy's
you
question.
guys have some incredibly reasonable prices on there
That's the
on
goal.
Vino Shipper.
That's the goal. I want to get natural wine to the people. I want it to become part of the culture, and I want to grow that as a category, like a legitimate category. It's wine by the people for the people. It's minimalist, saving money on chemicals and nutrients, putting it right back into reducing the price point. That's the goal.
Dude, that's awesome. I I'm so just like overwhelmed. It's like information overload. I'm gonna have to go back and rewatch
I
this like
warned
4 or 5 times, take notes. Like, I feel like by the time I go
you.
rewatch this, I'm gonna be like a graduate student in and of myself, and I'll be ready to come down there and start doing my hypothesis on your yeast and whatnot.
If you want to get a publication out of it, let's pitch some ideas.
Dude, I'm all about it.
All right.
Actually, one of the things I've been trying to do, there was a lady who I'd read a small publication that she did about the history of yeast and the the similarities between like bread yeast and beer yeast, and we're talking like thousands of years
Mhm.
of like history and evolution and stuff. And I was really been trying to get her on. You might even know who she is. I can't remember what her name is right now, but if I can get her on, I would love to have you guys on at the same time so we could have an even more in-depth yeast talk. Because I know somebody on there was kind of having a smart ass comment about, I don't even know why people are watching this. It's because people like really nerd out on their fermentation, and this is for homebrewers. This isn't the chug channel right now. We're not here chugging beers. As much as I love to chug a beer, hoppy growler, this isn't chug beer time. This is, we're having an in-depth conversation about some really cool mead making and home brewing techniques that, I really like. This is one of my favorite things to do, is to be able to share this type of knowledge with a lot of people, because I love it. I know if I'm loving it, nerding out on it, somebody else is too.
Oh yeah.
So I will let you go with that, because I cannot even fathom another route to conversate that's not going to last at least another 2 hours.
That's fair. That's fair. I could go. I'm also a mead historian, so I could tell you all about everything from hunter-gatherer societies
Oh,
in Africa, go all the way up the Nile, going into Egypt,
oh
teaching the
wow.
Egyptians and Ethiopians about mead, crossing the Mediterranean, teaching the Greeks about mead, and then how they took that up north into the Danish lands, and the Vikings came, spread that all out into the West, and then that just kept going all the way. So it's a fun conversation as well. Mead's a wonderful, incredible thing.
Actually, one of the guys I'm talking to is Dr. Garth Cambria. He's in South Africa at a place called
Cool, cool.
Makana Meadery,
Oh yeah, yeah,
and
yeah.
they're using like Zambezi
Mhm.
honey and all sorts of crazy monoflorals and wildflowers from Africa. I'm gonna have that. I'm gonna have them on coming up in February. So I'm really really excited to see what he's got to say. They've got some new honeys that they're trying to push out
Nice.
and get out to America and help some. I don't know what the term for it is. The best colloquialism I can use is kind of like fair trade honey. You know, they're trying to get some honey out of Zambia and get, you know, the proper amount of money right back to the people who are doing the work and everything. So I'm really excited to get to talk to him and all that stuff. So
That's awesome.
um,
Yeah.
well, I'll have to have you back on so we can talk the history of mead as well.
Sounds good. My favorite mead in the world is Tej out of Ethiopia. Try Tej if you've never had before. The Gesho bark makes the best wild fermentation you ever have.
I have
So yeah, I love African mead. It's
I've
incredible.
had one Tej from Brimminghorn up there in Delaware. It was delicious.
Nice.
I'll have
There
to
you
look
go.
out for as many more as I can get. Well, thank
Yeah.
you very much,
Awesome.
Nico. I appreciate your time tonight, and I will definitely be reaching out to you about doing another interview sometime in the future.
Sounds good, man. Look forward to it. Take care.
Good night, my brother.
All right. See ya.
See you. Oh man, that was a phenomenal conversation. Again, thank you everybody for powering through the technical difficulties in the beginning. I feel that this is probably one of my favorite conversations. If probably not, I think this is definitely in my top three best interviews, favorite interviews. I don't say about best, but favorite interviews. Nico's a wealth of information, and this was phenomenal. So one of the things that I wanted to talk about is my upcoming interviews. I always have my I never have my calendar on hand. Well, I've got my calendar on hand for upcoming interviews. So today, 17th was Stardust. So next week on the 24th, I'm not sure I have anything scheduled. We'll probably be doing a mead review. If somebody out there sees this and then wants to join me, go ahead and shoot me an email. But probably doing a double mead review or a single mead review come the 24th. On the 31st, we're going to be talking with Alan Martin. He is the current AMMA Home Brewer of the Year. It's his second time as AMMA Home Brewer of the Year. So definitely look forward to talking with him. Coming up on February 7th is going to be Brick Terrain Beer Hut, the high ABV life. This guy is a braggot and distilling type of master. This guy makes like super high ABV wines and ice wines and braggots and all sorts of stuff. So he's going to be joining me on the 7th of February. It's going to be a really unique conversation. Anybody's into doing super high ABV stuff that's not like completely distilling, but like a combo thing, definitely look this cat up and join me on the 7th. Going to probably be taking Valentine's Day off on the 14th, that Wednesday. You know, it is what it is. On the 21st, I don't currently have anything written down in my book, but I feel like I have something scheduled I forgot to write down. On the 28th is going to be, as I was talking about, it's going to be with Dr. Garth Cambray and Dan Bell of Forest Fruit Limited. They're guys trying to pull out Zambezi honey out of, I believe it's out of Zambia, or no, out of South Africa. I didn't get all the info. We're going to be talking with them. It's going to be a line on getting some crazy good African honey coming out of there, available to us here in America without having to incur international shipping fees, is the way I understand it. So join us for that and get definitely some clarification on that. Then coming up in March, we've got B&G Meadery on March 6th. That's headed up by Miss Cassandra. She is the only Native American female mead maker in the country that I know of. If somebody else can correct me on that, please do. I'd love to speak to any more Native American, let alone Native American female mead makers. See, March 13th, we've got Juniper Tree. On March 19th, I'm going to be speaking with Three Hands Mead. And I'm also trying for March to secure an interview with Allison Schramm of Schramm's Mead, because she is pretty much one of the pinnacles in female involvement in the mead industry, with the Mead Institute going on, working at Schramm's and all that stuff. So hopefully we can pull that together. No promises there. She's got a new baby in the house and all that type of stuff. But if we can get her, that would be amazing. So definitely join me in the coming weeks for some really great interviews. I appreciate everybody joining me and sticking through this far. Y'all have a fantastic evening, and I look forward to seeing y'all on the next one. Peace.